So welcome to this edition of On the Pulse, in which CMS experts provide updates on the key developments bringing innovation and disruption to the life sciences and healthcare sector. I'm your host, Nick Beckett. Today, we're looking into the contentious areas of product liability and medical malpractice, and I'm delighted to be joined by three of the CMS life sciences specialists who regularly advise clients in this sector. So we have David Bridge from the UK, Laura Opilio from Italy, and Alaina Wadsworth from the UK. So welcome to all three of you. So with COVID, we're living in interesting times, obviously. I think there's a lot of people who are concerned, who are worried, who are in need of support and help, medical assistance. And I think on the one hand, the healthcare professionals and the pharmaceutical companies are seen as the saviours. We have the Thursday clap for the NHS in the UK, and in Italy, I think maybe more impressive opera singing from balconies and things like that. And I think, the pharmaceutical companies through this have, improved their reputation. Everyone's needing these vaccines. So on the one hand, lots of sort of positives coming through, but there's also substantial risks, I think, there in two specific areas. In the area of medical negligence, we're seeing doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals who are playing out of position. They're being asked to do things that they're not normally asked to do without sometimes, substantial experience in some areas. We're seeing doctors being called out of retirement. We see hospitals with, being overrun and lacking capacity, lacking equipment. And I think this is not only impacting on obviously the COVID patients, but also non-COVID patients. Sometimes their procedures, elective surgery, those sorts of things are being pushed back. So, there's potential implications here, I think, on a medical negligence, medical malpractice basis. But we also then see on product liability, you're seeing a lot of non-specialist life sciences companies coming into the space. You're seeing ventilators being made by, car manufacturers. You're seeing PPE equipment, masks being made by textile manufacturers and others. So, again, this brings about further areas of risk. We're seeing experimental use and compassionate use of drugs for treatment that haven't been fully tested, that haven't necessarily been approved for certain indications. But the world is desperate, and in desperate times we're turning to whatever may be available. And clinical trials for vaccines are being rushed through quicker than ever before. And again, all of this brings risk. And I was reading, just in preparation for today, I was reading the CMS International Disputes Digest, and Laura wrote a nice article in it on the impact of COVID. I just want to read the heading from it. It says, the COVID-19 health emergency is causing incalculable economic losses to businesses and individuals. In periods of great crisis like this one, some parties will inevitably seek to apportion blame for those losses or pursue claims in relation to them. As Dwight D. Eisenhower remarked, the search for a scapegoat is the easiest of all hunting expeditions. As a result, we expect a substantial increase in conflicts and disputes, which will undoubtedly impact the insurance industry. In short, companies will face an explosion of insurance claims in the coming months. So there's a huge area of risk here, and I'd like to look at these two areas separately. I'd like to begin, I think, with medical malpractice. And I think probably just to set the scene, it might be helpful to just look at the underlying law here, the foundation of law that that people operating in this area need to be aware of. So maybe, Alaina, we could start in the UK. If you could just give us a high-level overview of the law there.
Sure. So medical malpractice is better known in the UK as medical negligence or clinical negligence. Generally, a duty of care is owed by a medical professional to their patient. And in order to establish a successful med-mal or clin-neg claim, the patient or the claimant has to prove that the duty of care owed has been breached, which is that the care provided by the medical professional fell below the required standard of care, the required standard being the standard of other professionals practicing in the same field. Secondly, causation has to be established, which is a but-for test, and the patient or claimant has to prove that they would not have suffered the injury but for the medical professional's negligence. Currently, to protect themselves against claims, medical professionals will either be a member of a medical defence organisation, which will provide their indemnity cover, or will have taken out separate insurance cover. limitation, i.e. the time allowed to bring a claim, also differs between the three jurisdictions within the UK. For example, whereas a claimant has 3 years to bring a claim in England and Wales, in Ireland they only have 2 years.
And Laura, in Italy, how does that compare to the UK?
In Italy, the situation is a bit more complex in the sense that in the last 10 years, the legislation has been deeply reformed in order to decrease the number of med mal claims brought against public hospitals, private clinics, and doctors, and also to reduce the use of defensive medicine, which implies huge cost for the public healthcare system. In Italy, all the citizens can afford the treatment from public hospitals. So defensive medicine became a real problem. We have a so-called double track system, which means that we have a criminal liability of doctors in case of fraud or gross negligence. The liability is assessed by a criminal court and damages are awarded afterward by the same criminal court or by a civil court. And there is also a civil liability of the public hospital, the private clinic, which is assessed by a civil court. The liability of the doctor, apart from the clinic, the criminal liability, is a tort liability on the assumption that the contractual link is established between the patient and the clinic or the hospital. So the liability of the doctor is a tort liability. This is a very important difference with respect to the burden of proof. In case of tort liability, the burden of proof lies on the patient. It's the patient who has to show that the medical treatment was negligent, was not correct, and that the injuries or the disease was caused by that treatment. So the causal link has to be proved by the patient. In case of contractual liability, the burden of proof lies on the hospital or on the private clinic. So they have to prove that the treatment which was applied to the patient was the proper one. So it's much more easier for a patient to claim damages against an hospital or a clinic in comparison with the claim brought against the doctor, because the burden of proof is completely different. Also, the time limitation is 10 years for contractual obligation, as 5 years for tort liability. So this was intended to protect doctors and give more liability to the clinics and the hospitals.
And David, what about other jurisdictions? Do they follow the UK more or Italy?
Well, further afield, if we take the UAE, for example, I think it's fair to say that does have some similarities with the Italian approach, because in the UAE, the doctor-patient relationship is more of a contractual one. And it's therefore seen as a breach of contract as opposed to a breach of duty if the doctor's found to have made what's called a medical error, as it's referred to in the UAE. And there are essentially three things you've got to prove. Firstly, you've got to show that there's a medical error. Secondly, you've got to show that error causes damage. And then thirdly, as a result of that damage, the patient has suffered a loss. And of those three elements, the UAE courts, in our experience, typically don't place quite as much emphasis on causation. The focus is more on showing that fault and damage has occurred. And we've also seen in the UAE in the last year a cabinet decision known as the executive decision, which is intended to bring in new provisions to define and refine the liability of medical professionals in greater detail and make it easier to bring these sorts of claims. So, for example, you can now bring claims to health authorities online, and there's also a positive obligation on an entity called the Medical Liability Committee in the UAE to intervene and analyse each complaint. And if we look beyond the UAE as well to the US, in the US, it's very much an approach that's dependent upon which state you're in. Generally, you've got a similar approach in that you've got to show a substandard medical care resulted in an injury, and the patient's got to prove the main elements that you would need to prove typically in the UK, so breach of a duty and a causal link between the breach of duty and the loss. The big difference in the US, of course, is the damages aspect, because in the US, they approach damages on a very different basis. You are departing from the compensatory principle. And then if we look at other jurisdictions, Australia, Singapore, very similar to the UK position, as development of the Commonwealth approach.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for that. That's a helpful sort of underpinning to the rest of the session. So I'd like to turn then to look at the impact of COVID. How has it changed things in terms of medical malpractice in different jurisdictions? So maybe let's start with Laura on that one for Italy.
Yes, due to the COVID, we can foresee an increase of medical claims brought against public hospitals and doctors. For sure, when the COVID emergency started in Italy, hospitals were not equipped to cope with this emergency. So patients could bring claims based on the lack of organization of the hospitals, because, for instance, many hospitalized patients were infected while they were at the hospital by doctors or nurses, because the COVID patients were not immediately isolated from other patients. There was a lack of doctors, so the number of patients per doctor was too high, and also the equipment of the hospitals were not sufficient. Some doctors already retired were requested to pay assistance to the patients on a voluntary basis. Some doctors were not experienced in the field, and notwithstanding that, they were requested to treat COVID patients. And as you mentioned before, Nick, some drugs were used off-label, so there was not a specific indication to treat COVID with these medicines, but the doctors use these medicines on the basis of experience of other countries because they resulted to be useful, or they believe they could be useful for the treatment. Some hospitals asked for the authorization to use drugs which were not marketed in Italy on a compassionate basis. At the first times, in the first 2 months, there was no unique commission to authorize the importation of these drugs. So any hospital did it on an individual basis, and there was no coordination at all. So considering this situation, it is possible that some patients, or unfortunately the relatives of patients who died, will claim damages against the public hospitals and against doctors. Also, private clinics might be affected because, for instance, in some places where old people used to live, the diffusion of the disease was so quick that, unfortunately, many patients died. So we can really foresee an increase of claims which will be brought against the hospitals and doctors and private clinics. The government discussed about the possibility to introduce an immunity shield to protect doctors and medical institutions. This in the end was not approved because the matter is really complex. Not only doctors, but also directors of hospitals and clinics, and also the administrative staff should be protected by the legislation. So the matter is still under discussion at the Parliament, and we really hope that in the end a decision will be taken, because this climate of uncertainty is very difficult to cope with by the professionals.
And Alaina, how has COVID impacted medical malpractice in the UK?
So similar to Italy, we also have examples of products being used off-label. We've also had a number of doctors and nurses come back from retirement to be used to assist the NHS with treatments. Due to many medical professionals acting outside of their usual day-to-day job and therefore outside of their expertise, there has been discussion around giving doctors immunity from negligence claims arising from treatment given during the coronavirus crisis. This is to try to prevent huge numbers of claims being brought against medical professionals at a time when, without them, the fatality figures may well have been somewhat higher than they actually have been to date. There is also talk of immunity because of the strain this will put on NHS funds and the taxpayer at a time when the economy is trying to recover. Further, there has also been talks and calls on the government to bring in emergency laws so doctors are protected from criminal and regulatory investigation in relation to their treatment of patients during the crisis, particularly where a decision or outcome is concerned, which is the result of poor PPE provision, which appeared to be the case in the UK, certainly at the start of the crisis. Currently in the UK, the Coronavirus Act 2020, which was brought into force extremely swiftly when we were faced with a pandemic, addresses those medical professionals who offer their services during the crisis. However, it only extends indemnity cover to those medical professionals acting outside of their expertise, and it does not mean that they are immune from such claims that may arise from acting outside of their expertise. There has also been discussions around claims which may arise indirectly from the coronavirus crisis. For example, those patients whose treatment was put on hold or delayed due to the crisis, for example, cancer patients.
So, David, what about the US? I think there was discussion of maybe a blanket form of immunity there.
Yeah, I mean, the US has got its own particular challenges, as I think has been well reported at the moment, and it's a matter for each state in the US, as I mentioned, as to how they respond to that. And it has been reported that as of the 30th of June, there were some 23 states that had adopted laws which provide immunity to medical professionals and hospitals during the crisis. So New York is in a state, for example, that's done that. There's also been some public commentary from the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who's said that he wouldn't let healthcare heroes emerge from this crisis facing a tidal wave of medical malpractice claims. And he's talking about raising the liability threshold for these sorts of coronavirus-related claims. And I think we're going to see in the future the number of states that change their immunity position on the rise. And in addition, there's been a very recent US Department of Health declaration that provides a broad-based legal immunity under federal and state law for manufacturers, suppliers, administrators of products and technologies used to combat COVID-19. And that protection lasts at the moment until the 1st of October 2024.
And what about other jurisdictions, David? Are they following a similar pattern to that?
Not yet. So I mentioned the UAE. There hasn't really been much discussion in the UAE about immunity, although there have been some very prestigious hospitals. So the Cleveland Clinic in Abu Dhabi, as part of the Cleveland Clinic Foundation in the USA, has published some guidance on some of these medical professionals that are volunteering, so perhaps coming out of retirement to help. And it's suggested that whilst there's no immunity for them, there'll be full medical malpractice insurance cover for anyone who's volunteered. If you look further afield to Australia, again, there's been no discussion yet with regard to immunity, but there have been some high-profile incidents that are likely to fuel claims. So the Ruby Princess affair, which was the incident with the cruise ship docking without passengers having health screening, has given rise to some potential claims that are being marshalled on a class action basis at the moment, potentially against the ship's operator and even the government of Australia in relation to that decision. So we may well see a change in approach in relation to immunity. And similarly, Singapore, there hasn't yet been that debate, but I would watch this space because we may hear something on that in the not too distant future.
So let's move on then to the other area of risk that we were outlining at the beginning, that of product liability. And again, I think probably would be helpful just to begin with a short overview, high-level overview of the basic law. So maybe, David, we'll start with the UK and what options an individual might have if they're harmed by a product there.
Sure. So the starting point in the UK and the key piece of legislation is the Consumer Protection Act 1987, the CPA, and that deals with defective products and what happens if they cause injury. So if a consumer uses a product and they suffer injury as a result of a defect, they can claim under this act without needing to prove fault or blame for the damage caused. So it's a strict liability approach. The definition of product under the CPA is very wide. It includes the goods in question, of course, and also components of goods. And a product is considered defective if its safety is not such as people are generally entitled to expect. And if you're a consumer that's been affected and you're looking at who you might pursue an action, you've got a number of options. So a claim can be brought potentially against the producers. So that's usually the manufacturer of the product. Own branders, those who put their name or trademark on the product, or an importer into the EU from a non-EU country, or if actually the consumer doesn't know the identity of any of those parties, they could also bring a claim against the supplier. There's a time limit in place, so there's a 3-year limitation period from the date of damage or injury or when that person became aware of their possible claim. And as I mentioned, in England, damages are awarded on a compensatory basis. So the aim is to put the consumer back in the position as if the product hadn't been defective. But there is no cap on liability, but there is a 10-year log stop date. So from the date of supply of the product, you've got 10 years in which to pursue your action. Although liability under the CPA is strict, there are some defences available. So if, for example, the defect was due to compliance with a legal obligation that was imposed at the time, or the so-called development risks defence, which is where a producer argues that the state of scientific or technical knowledge was such that at the time they couldn't have been expected to discover the defect when the product was in their control. And then the final thing I'll just mention is separate from the CPA, you've got the Consumer Rights Act 2015 in the UK that gives consumers contractual rights and protections for defective products and services.
And Laura, how does the situation in Italy compare to that?
The situation is similar in the sense that we also apply a strict liability principle for product liability claims. As far as the medical devices are concerned, we implemented the 3 European directives on medical devices, in vitro diagnostic devices, and active implantable devices. Unfortunately, this legislation became outdated very quickly because it didn't provide for sufficient protection for consumers. The devices were not traceable, and the technical standard couldn't be properly assessed in the time. So the European legislation was amended. The new medical devices regulation should have come into force. Unfortunately, due to the coronavirus situation, it was decided to postpone the entry into force of the new regulation, which will now come into force in May, on the 26th of May 2021. Up to that time, the medical devices can be still placed into market according to the old rules, that do not provide for a clear definition of defectiveness, while the new regulation introduces this concept of defective specifically for medical devices, and also introduce a mechanism of traceability of the devices which will be enforced and protect the consumers in a more serious way. Patients are allowed to claim damage compensation according to the national rules. And as I mentioned before, according to Italian law, there is a principle of strict liability, similarly as in UK, so that the producer, the importer, and the distributor are liable for any defect of the product. So the situation from this point of view is quite similar, I would say.
David, forgive me, I'm going to come to you again as our sort of resident international disputes expert. But any guide on other jurisdictions and the situation there?
Sure. So I'll mention two. So Singapore doesn't itself have strict liability legislation for defective products. There are laws which regulate the safety standards to which consumer goods must conform, and there are fines that apply if they don't. And a buyer can bring a claim under contract law or in negligence. In the US, the product liability law is a mix of state, federal, and common law. There's no single product liability statute which governs everything, but the rules vary from state to state, and you can bring a claim. In the US, one of the main features of litigation is class action. So you see a lot of group litigation that's pursued. Very common. We've seen a proliferation of that sort of type of dispute that's emerging and making its way over into Europe too. And I think we're going to see more of that to come. If you look at the UAE, the Middle East, class action's a very alien concept there. They're not recognised, so a claimant would need to pursue a claim individually. But one of the barriers to entry for people to do that, particularly in the UK, is the cost of litigation, whereas in the UAE, the court fees are typically much lower and can be, a few thousand dirham just to pursue the case. So that's not in and of itself a problem.
So I'd like then to turn to, again, look at the impact of COVID on this. So, we see, for example, ventilators being, produced at a really rapid rate. So how is, what are the implications of that, for example, in the UK, Alaina?
So at the beginning of lockdown, the government asked for help in making ventilators, and specifically rapidly manufactured ventilator systems, or RMVS for short. Companies stepped outside of their normal expertise to do this. For example, companies who normally manufactured other products, such as cars, pivoted to producing ventilators, making it more of a risk for them to take on. To encourage production, the government stated that it would indemnify the designers and manufacturers of these ventilators against any product liability claims. However, the exact terms of these indemnities is confidential as between the parties, so it's not clear if the indemnities are subject to a cap, and if they are, what that cap is. The UK government did not extend this indemnity to beyond ventilators, for example, to PPE or to other medical devices such as COVID-19 testing kits. It's also important to remember that indemnities do not prevent claims from being made, so there's still a liability, of course, for the company to take on.
And what about Italy, Laura? I assume we've seen a surge in demand for PPE equipment there as well.
Yes, exactly. Especially at the beginning of the emergency, we immediately ran short of PPE and also medical protection devices like masks, gloves, and of course ventilators, lab coats. It was very difficult to import these products from abroad, given the fact that, of course, all the countries were preparing themselves for the emergency. So in the end, the government authorized the production of these devices in Italy, and also funded the production in Italy. And quality assessment procedures was derogated, notwithstanding that the producer had to certify that the production was made according to the health and safety regulation rules. The government entrusted INAIL, which is a public insurance entity aimed at protecting workers and employees, to validate the sale of these equipments. So the producer gave a self-declaration by which they assured that the products were manufactured according to the good manufacturing procedures, and they had to show which tests were carried out on the products. On the basis of this self-declaration, the devices were put on the market. This was done also in compliance with what the European Committee authorized, because a recommendation was passed by which the countries were allowed in emergency situation to derogate from the ordinary procedure before placing on the market these devices. Of course, this can be done just for a very limited period of time, enough to allow the normal procedure to be reinstalled. But this was the situation at the time. This will probably give rise to possible claims against the producers if the medical devices result in the future to be not compliant with the good manufacturing rules.
And Alaina, did the UK allow for any derogations or make any changes to allow for medicines and medical devices to be made available more quickly?
Yes, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or MHRA, which is the body responsible for regulating medicines and medical devices, played a role in relaxing rules wherever possible. In the pandemic, approval for medical devices was fast-tracked, and devices not marked with the CE stamp can be used if it is in the interest of protecting public health. The MHRA has also released guidance that the rapidly manufactured ventilators will not bear the CE marking and were approved using the exceptional use channel. Additionally, the MHRA recognised it was essential to use some devices, for example, anaesthetic machines as ventilators, off-label during the pandemic. However, the appropriate risk assessment still needed to take place to document the off-label use.
And David, have any other jurisdictions adopted a similar sort of relaxation of requirements?
Yes, we've seen other jurisdictions taking a similar approach. So, for example, in the US, they've relaxed certain requirements, and for example, they've implemented emergency use authorization with the aim of increasing the availability of ventilators. And in doing so, they've authorized the use of ventilators that are not currently marketed in the US. And on the drug side, we've seen the FDA, the Food Drug Administration, has authorized the emergency use of the drug remdesivir, which I'm sure you've read about. That's not a drug that's approved by the FDA, but it's now being used for treating hospitalized patients with severe COVID-19. And it's also allowed the US to buy up in very large quantities the stock of that drug for the next few months ahead.
So I think we're seeing then that COVID, is playing a major role in shaping and impacting both medical malpractice and also product liability. And I think it brings challenges to a lot of people involved, to the regulators, I guess, and those involved in public policy. It's always going to be about trying to find a balance, trying to find the risk-benefit equation to have a positive outcome for that, and to find acceptable safety, maybe shortening the time frame for clinical trials, maybe increasing post-marketing surveillance, pharmacovigilance, those sorts of things, and ensuring, a comfort on a sufficient benefit in what may well be an experimental drug or a very quickly developed vaccine, those sorts of things. So I think there are challenges from the regulator and public sort of policy side, but there are obviously challenges for companies operating, in this space and in these COVID times. And I wonder, David, have you got any advice to companies on what they can practically do to sort of minimize risk in these areas?
Yes, so those companies are obviously operating in a highly regulated environment. And I think first and foremost, as a first line of defence, you've got to consider good regulatory compliance and do everything possible to try to get it right, particularly with a novel regime to grapple with. And that includes also monitoring regulatory positions for changes that might be both positive and negative. And also, importantly, documenting everything, including any derogations, exemptions or permissions when you're dealing with the regulator, if they give leniencies in relation to a particular product. And I think where possible, if you need it, ask for the regulatory authorities to clarify their position in writing. I think it's also really critical to consider proactively addressing potential future facets of a liability claim, including marketing, labelling, and you might be presenting the product to make clear it's supplied during the time of the pandemic or specifically for the purpose of treating COVID-19. And generally look at the risk profile of each of the proposed actions, product lines and pivots, as they're likely to be unique in the current circumstances. If you're looking at a long-term strategy for the supplying of products and doing so in the supply chain, I think it's important to consider how that might be limited to the extent of the current pandemic. And if you're involved in any active litigation, it's really important to consider the impact of the pandemic on your liability profile and defences. And then the final thing I will just say, and this will probably touch on what Alaina's going to talk about, is look at the insurance position in terms of repurposing or pivoting of business, products, supplies, manufacturing, or any change to your business.
Yes, so to assist with countering some of the risks that David has just mentioned, companies can look to their medical negligence or their product liability insurance coverages. However, before agreeing to offer medical services outside of the company's usual offering or switching to manufacturing new products, they should ensure that the cover they have in place is appropriate and extends to what they are looking to offer. For example, a vehicle manufacturer is unlikely to be insured for producing medical devices without an extension to their existing coverage. Further, companies will need to ensure that any insurance or indemnity provisions in supply contracts for such medical services or products dovetail with their insurance arrangements and do not leave them exposed to claims they believe to be covered by their insurance or the indemnity arrangement under the contract. We have seen a number of examples already in supply contracts that would leave corporates exposed where insurance would not pick up the risk that they contractually believe it will. To help mitigate that risk, corporates are always well advised to engage early with their insurance brokers and their insurers to allow sufficient time to negotiate any necessary amendments either to the insurance coverage where possible and or to the supply contract.
Sound advice. So engage the experts early. So thanks to all of you, fascinating discussions. Thank you for joining us for this edition of On the Pulse. We hoped you found our discussions to be thought-provoking and insightful. If you'd like to discuss any of the topics covered, please do get in touch. To find out more about On the Pulse and CMS's Global Life Sciences and Healthcare Group, visit cms.law. Audio versions of On the Pulse are available through your usual podcast store.